Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast, where we answer your sales distress calls. I'm Liz Heiman, and each week I'm joined by your crew of seasoned sales experts who have navigated these waters and come out victorious. So if you're ready to turn your sales distress into sales success, you're in the right place. Let's dive into today's topic. Welcome to the Sales SOS podcast. I'm Liz Heiman, your host, and I'm here with your Sales SOS podcast crew. These incredible sales and marketing experts who are here to answer your questions. And today we're talking about sales methodology. If you missed the last episode, go back and listen to that because we were talking about what is sales methodology. And in this segment, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you implement a sales methodology. And as we're talking about it, we may refer to one or another different sales methodologies, but really what we're trying to get to is once you've decided that you want to implement a sales methodology, what do you expect from your team? How do you make this happen? What do you have to do? How do you reinforce? So I'm gonna put Chris on the hot seat here because I think he has some really good thoughts about how to get started. Did I introduce you guys on the first time? Okay, well, let me just introduce your crew to you. This is Chris Bowen, it's highlighted here, and Renee Bigelow, and Brynne Tillman, and Mike Simmons. I can't remember what I've done from episode to episode. Thanks for joining us.
So I know when you start to look at what methodology you're picking or why you're picking it or what you need to first understand what's that going to mean to those individual sellers, to those leaders. And just as you have to with prospects and customers, you have to be able to find what's in it for them, right? Why is it that they need this process, or why is it that the company needs this process? Sometimes I do a lot in the services side. You're going to end up in a situation where we're making hiring projections for what we're going to bring on from staff and things like that based on where we're at with different deals in our pipeline, because we're trying to be as responsive as we can to our customers. So that's one of the things that you have to look at. But you also have to look at, how do I make sure that I know when things are going off the rails, when things are progressing as they should? I think we've all encountered stale pipelines that, the what I call the ever slipping deal. It slips from this quarter, then at the end of next quarter, it slips, and then it slips again. And if you have the right methodology or the right process, hopefully you have the tools to be able to ask the right questions. And so you can uncover, is that real? Right? Because my first thought is almost always, that's not real. It may sound real. You may be having conversations. You may be having good conversations. It feels like the person that's on the other end of that conversation is more your friend than they are your customer. And I'm not saying those two things are necessarily always separate, but in this case, they're not the same. So you need to make sure you know what you're doing and how you're doing it. And then what pieces, if you take a methodology, are there pieces of that methodology that may not fit your organization? So maybe you have to adapt them. You have to adjust. You have to make sure that how am I now going to change this? Because if it either doesn't work for us, doesn't work for our process, doesn't work for our buyers, doesn't match our culture. Just because it's a methodology doesn't mean you have to accept it wholesale. Like you understand your business better than any methodology is going to. It's automatically genericized to a degree. So that's my first thought. And it looks like Brynne's got her hand.
Thank you. That was awesome, by the way. I have a 7-step onboarding to make sure, and it's not, and it works for the LinkedIn program, but I think it works here. So we start with the why. Why are we doing this? Why, you've got to get that Simon Sinek why in first. Because if they don't understand why we're making this change, why we're bringing in a new methodology, the adoption is low. The second thing I believe is make sure that you co-create, don't dictate. When you dictate, this is what we're doing, your sales folks are going to get their backs up and go, oh, I don't like that. I don't like the way that sounds. But when they are part of bringing this new methodology in, they're going to get a much higher buy-in. We also need to connect it to reality. A lot of times we will roll something out and it will be detached from what they're experiencing in the field or they're experiencing on the phone. And so they're going to say, that's not going to work. It's not going to work. I know I've been doing this for 3 years. It's just not going to work. So we have to make sure that we've got that bridge. We also need to make sure it's coachable. If we cannot create a methodology that we can't help them improve in. So the methodology we bring in needs to come with the right KPIs that align with what we're looking to get out of this methodology and make sure that it's coachable. We need to celebrate small wins very quickly. When someone implements it, we need to say, big win, even in the small wins, right? We've got to make sure we're doing that to get that, the buy-in. I keep saying buy-in, but that's really what it is, buy into this new methodology. We need to integrate it, don't stack it on as new. And this is the biggest thing that I need to do from a LinkedIn perspective, because the number one objection I get from sales folks is, I don't have time to put this into my day. I don't have time for another thing. How do you think I'm going to get LinkedIn along with my emails and my phone calls and my meetings and my this? I don't have time for LinkedIn. So I believe that this also fits with the methodology, is it has to seamlessly integrate with what they're already doing. Don't make it more, right? Make it integrated so it flows naturally. And the last one is each rep needs to be able to tailor it to their perspective on things without it breaking the system. So that they, and they may say, hey, if I say it like this, is this keeping the integrity of the methodology? Because I'm more comfortable saying this. Like for me, I will always say, if you're open to exploring, let's chat. Well, I have someone on my team that doesn't like if you're open to exploring. They want to say, I've got some ideas for you. If you'd like to know those ideas, let me know. We'll chat. Well, that is completely, integrated into what we do. It's fine. They can go do it that way. I can do it my way without it contradicting each other. So just recap that. Start with the why. Co-create, don't dictate. Connect it to reality. Make sure it's coachable. Celebrate the small wins, integrate, don't stack, and make it tailorable. Okay, I'm done now.
I have a bunch of things that I want to clarify and kind of reiterate. One is, in the last episode, we were talking about what is a methodology. Mike gave us a bunch of explanations about methods and methodology. We talked about philosophy. Again, listen to it. It was a really great way to think about all this. But I want to take us back to this idea. Brynne, without saying it, was talking about playbooks, right? So she didn't use the word playbook, but she was talking about, this is what you do. This is our playbook. And I want to differentiate for you the difference between a methodology that you map out in a playbook versus a script. So you may have a script as part of your playbook, but a playbook isn't necessarily a script. A playbook may be a set of rules, a set of steps, a bunch of ideas about what you might do at a different time. When I create a sales process that aligns with the sales funnel in the methodology that I teach, I want to make sure that when you're prospecting, if you're in that stage, these are the kinds of activities that you'll be doing. And these are the kinds of questions that you'll be asking. I don't necessarily say you have to ask this question in some way. In some companies, they do say you need to ask this question in this way. And so if you are a salesperson picking where you want to work, be thoughtful about that. And if you're a sales manager and you have a salesperson who says, I'm just not comfortable saying that. And I'm gonna hopefully not upset anybody when I say this. Often those sales playbooks are written by men, or you're using a tool like Gong, which is pulling more information from what men say because there's more men in sales. And then you often have women who will say, it doesn't work for me when I say it like that. I say this. And so we want to be really thoughtful, again, about the difference between what is a playbook, what is a methodology, what is a script, and when are scripts appropriate. And Chris is chopping at the bit here. What do you want to tell me?
No, I agree with you. I mean, my thing is I personally don't like scripts. I like, if you're going to tell people, what are we trying to get out from this particular portion of the process or where we're at, that's great. How you, and give them examples that could look like scripts, but let them put it in their own language, in their own words. They're going to come across as much more authentic, much more real than if you give them a script. At least 50% of your people are going to sound like a robot. And who wants to interact with that? If you're going to be putting it forward, what are we trying to understand? What is it that we need to get out of it? What is it that we want to convey to our potential buyers? And then you all can workshop different ideas around, here's how I would approach that. Here's what I've had success with when you have your team meetings and things like that. Here's what's not working. Someone else will have a different idea. A lot of times these things aren't 180 degrees apart from the way that one person says it versus another. They're 10, 15 degrees, little minor adjustments here and there. But the way that someone says, you can have two people that say the exact same thing. They say it in slightly different ways. And one of those is going to more resonate with somebody than another. So that's how I tend to look at those things when you get into scripting, is you got to own it. And the only way you're going to own it is if it's the way that you communicate.
Can I jump in for just a second?
Hang on a sec.
Oh, sure.
There you go.
I just wanted to say, I think that there's a misnomer around scripts, right? There are definitely some people who say, this is what you say and do not deviate from it. This is important. I think we need to set them aside because we know that that's not the best practice, right? A script is putting a pattern in front of someone to help them to go from 0 to 1, right? To get them from, I don't know how to think about this, to, okay, now I kind of know what I'm supposed to do. Let me do my thing, right? It is a pattern that you are giving them. Where I think a lot of tension comes up is if you dictate, right? Number one. And to your point, Chris, it's incredibly hard to come across as an authentic person if you are reading a script someone else wrote for you, right? Very few people are Oscar-winning actors who can pull that off and not sound inauthentic. So that's tension number one. Tension number two is if you aren't clear on what is non-negotiable to change and what is negotiable to change. It might be as simple as we have a promotion, right? And you qualify for a discount if whatever those if terms are non-negotiable. Like you do need to know what those are and they're written in because we've set guidelines for it, right? But how you talk about it and how you introduce it and things like that is fully customizable. We've just given you a really good example that you can run from, right? And I think that so many people get like on scripts because of the small minority of people who dictate this is exactly how you have to do it. And they're a very important part of a playbook because when a sales rep is super busy or new or green or hasn't done this before, whatever you want to choose, right? They can sit and look at it and have something to start with instead of having to spend 30 minutes to figure out what they're supposed to say. You just have to
I
clarify on script.
absolutely understand that. So I would say if you look at our business, we sell essentially everything under the sun. But if I'm talking to someone who's looking to replace things in their data center from a hardware perspective versus a solution perspective, is very different than cybersecurity professionals manning a NOC, which is very different than implementing something like Salesforce or SAP or any other packaged solution versus custom development. The way you talk about all those things is very, very different. So a playbook can get you up to speed on what are the main things, what are the main values that we have here, what are the artifacts that we have internally that differentiate us from the plethora of competition that's out there, and then being able to deal with it that way.
I think it's the difference between saying, here's the list of questions you must ask in this order, and every single one must get asked versus here's the information that you need to get in order for us to be able to develop a solution. And here are some ways that you might ask those questions, right? Those are two different things. They get a different result from a salesperson.
And really understanding where in the process is it that I have to have that information. Because a lot of times when you see people setting up CRMs, some of the information they think you're going to have on an initial opportunity is inappropriate for that part of the process. You might have it some of the time, but most of the time you're not. Like if you're having ongoing conversations, by the time we get to, if we have a 5-step process, by the time we get to step 3 in that process, we do need to have these things because we've now decided we're committing resources to this thing semi-substantially, right? So being able to understand where it is that we have to have the information is really important. And so methodology can help you make sure that you're sussing some of that stuff.
So let's talk a little bit more about building methodology into CRM, because this is one of the ways that we reinforce methodology with our team. When we have the language built into the CRM that we're using, either in the pipeline, in the different stages, some CRMs will pop up at different times and give you suggested questions to ask. So as we're thinking about this is when we start thinking about which methodology am I implementing where. So if we're talking about technical, how do I engage? How do I use, then you would use something like a spin or a challenger or a Sandler, where they're telling you how to engage and how to ask questions. And if you are using one of those methodologies, then you've built that into the CRM to give your salespeople prompts to guide them. Again, does that mean that they have to ask every single question that's on the list in exactly the way that it's written and have your clients just go, for goodness sake, I answered that 6 times. You just asked the question differently. I gave you all of it, right? You don't want your customer doing that. But you can, if you have chosen a methodology for engagement, how do we engage? How do we interact? You can build that into the system and then reinforce that with your salespeople. And then what Brynne was talking about, managing, then you know what kinds of questions, what kind of engagement you want them to have, and you can manage around those. Now, I am not going to say you need to use spin or you need to use, I'm going to say, if you want to know how to do that, use conceptual selling and strategic selling. But you need to pick the one that's right for your, and we're going to talk more about that, choosing the right methodology. But how do you reinforce it? Mike, did you have a thought on this?
Yeah, I'll just summarize a couple of things I heard. One, integrating into workflow piece and being really clear around the work that needs to be done and the results you want to get. Those kind of things. And integrating into workflow, know what work needs to be done and results you'll be on the path to do this really, really well. The hard part is knowing those things.
I think it's also really important to remember that when you're implementing a methodology, there is some change management that has to happen. And unless you share it with everybody, like if accounting is using a different language than sales, then you're having miscommunication. If the sales managers aren't asking the questions that tie in specifically to how you said you're going to do this, then you're have miscommunication and frustration, and your salespeople aren't going to do it. If you bring your salespeople in to report to the CEO and the CEO is using a different language, you're going to have a problem. So if you are implementing a methodology and a language and a way of communicating, you need to make sure that the entire company understands how you are going to speak around sales opportunities and engagement. Any other thoughts on how to implement it, what to expect from your sales team, how to get them doing it? Because I see, I'm going to let you speak. I see people bringing it in and then the salespeople refusing to use the language, right? You see stuff like this where they're just, so how do you, Renee, share with us what you were going to say before I
say you were talking about change management. I mean, anytime you're bringing in a new methodology, it's like you have change management that goes with it. And I know that gets like everybody's eyes roll when they hear change management, right? A little bit of a pause or whatever. But one of the big things I do in marketing to help with messaging, right, for external audiences is also really relevant for marketing to internal audiences. first of all, treat doing something like this as a campaign to your staff. Put some planning into it and treat it like a campaign. Make sure you have frequency of messaging. Make sure you're reaching them in different ways, right? All of the same basic fundamentals that you would do for an external campaign. Make sure you're planning those on an internal campaign. And making sure that you're also hitting the emotional levers that make people want to buy in. Find your champions that can be your spokespeople, people who already do a lot of these things naturally or have used it in the past. Let them tell some of the stories of success, right? So if you start thinking about it like a marketing campaign, then you start thinking about ways that you're going to get people to naturally want to come along, right? You aren't forcing people, or you aren't successfully often forcing people into things in a marketing campaign to get them to convert to revenue. The same principles apply for getting internal people to do the things that you want. And I would say another big piece of marketing, particularly like in a B2B environment, which relates very well to internal teams, is shrink the change. So if you have this entire methodology and you can roll out a portion of it, as you pointed out, breaking down the problems into different areas. If your biggest problem is qualifying leads, right? And your methodology has something for qualifying leads and a whole bunch of other stuff, just focus on that part to start. Like find somewhere where you can shrink the change and get consensus rather than trying to rock everybody's world with all the things. You know, the movie title, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, is now my new catchphrase for all the chaos that people like to change, like to create from change, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once doesn't really work. So shrink the change.
Thanks, Renee. That was, I think that's really important. This how we implement the change really matters. Okay, well, let's wrap up this episode unless anybody has anything additional to add about how you implement it, how to reinforce it. Gamification is always a good thing, right?
That goes to that frequency and thinking of it like a marketing campaign, right? Like, how do you make it fun? That's the emotion. How do you make it fun? How do you reward people for good behavior? Make sure that you're showcasing them. Frequency of bringing it up. All of that goes into thinking about it as a long-term campaign, not just, well, we rolled that out last month. I don't understand why they aren't doing it. We explained it once.
Yes. Okay, so thanks for joining us for this episode of the Sales SOS podcast. In our next episode, we're going to talk more about methodology. So I hope you'll hear us or you'll join us there. And we'll see you just on the other side. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Sales SOS podcast. A huge thank you to our experts for throwing us a lifeline with their insights. We hope that episode has equipped you to navigate sales leadership with confidence. Never miss an episode. Subscribe to your Sales SOS podcast on your favorite platform. If you have questions, comments, or topics you'd like us to explore, join us live on LinkedIn every second Friday or share your questions on LinkedIn or YouTube. Until next time, keep sailing toward your sales goals.